Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Campfire, where we tell stories and enjoy each other's company, get a chance to see people we haven't seen in a while. That's what this is all about. And while we're doing that, we tell stories. I got some story to tell you tonight. We've been talking about Danbury's daughter lately. We're on chapter 34 now of this book by Max Brand. And there's a whole 2 other books that we read about Danbury that are pretty good story. And you can listen to them one after another if you like. Then you just have to dig around a little bit on the channel. Tonight we're going to carry on with chapter 34, and we're almost done with this book. And we'll have to start another. And it starts with The Vengeful Bullets. Well, they'd made their trip down from the mountains perhaps half an hour before their scheduled time. So well had the horses done their work, and so eager were the riders to get to the town. The clearness of the light from even that old moon which hung in the sky and had worried them a little as they came down into the valley. But before they reached the town of Wixon, the high-blown haze of clouds had passed across the surface of the moon and made it as dim as a sickle of tarnished tin. Under these favorable auspices, they reached the town itself. Now, sweeping in a half circle around it ran the river, which had furnished the wealth to the valley, and now a dull and muddy trickle in the shallow basin, for most of the current had been drawn off higher up the course to water the fields. The hooves of the horses sounded hollow on the bridge, and then they entered the long main street. Wixon was soundly asleep. At least there was not a light shining in a single window, and the houses watched them go by with blank faces. At the very first corner they separated, as the previous agreement had been. Gloucester and MacArthur rode up on the main street, and the others turned to the side streets. They were to circle around the block and come in again to wait near the bank in case of an alarm. All was so carefully arranged that there appeared slight danger of any interruption, and yet the heart of Harry Gloucester was hammering as he went on with the leader. Not a word passed between them, however. They left their horses behind the bank and they passed around to the front. The key which the cashier had furnished to MacArthur fitted the door. It opened to them, and they stepped inside the black interior. And all was perfectly still, except that the wind which had entered with them rattled papers somewhere in the distance. But when that door was closed behind them, there was perfect quiet. With his electric pocket torch, MacArthur cast a swift ray of light around the place. So swift indeed that Gloucester saw nothing but a blur of many outlines. But to the leader all seemed to be as clear as day. For he went on now with a perfect assurance, and after Gloucester had stumbled over a chair, he fell in behind MacArthur. They found their way straight to the safe, on which MacArthur flashed the light, partly hooding it with his hand so that only a dim radiance fell on the combination. He took a slip of paper from his pocket, and as he read the numbers, Gloucester worked the combination, and as he worked it, his heart sank within him. Once, indeed, his numbed fingers refused to stir the disc, and he was about to stand up and confess that he could go on no further. But if he did that, he was erecting a wall between himself and the chance of seeing Joan again. So he kept on until, with a faint click, the heavy door yawned slowly wide before them. There was little time for conscience to work then. In a moment, MacArthur had unlocked the drawer which Kearney had previously designated. It was a deep compartment, and from it he drew out small packages done up in strong paper. Half of them he gave to Gloucester. The other half he stuffed in his own pockets. "This here job," he said with a grin finally, "is what you might call getting the stuff deluxe, huh?" "Not so loud," gasped Gloucester. MacArthur raised his eyes quickly. "You look as white as a sick kid," he commented. "Kind of weak in the stomach, Harry?" The latter shrugged his shoulders. Well, don't let that worry you none, MacArthur went on. That's the way with the best of us the first time out. It sure bites in on a fellow his first trip. But now the second, that's easy as pie. That's always the way. Let's have a look at this stuff. For God's sake, breathed Gloucester, are you going to waste time now? MacArthur chuckled, and his voice sounded deep and strong in the room. There ain't no danger, he declared. This is a cinch for us, Gloucester. The old town is sound asleep. I can almost hear him snoring, can't you? Gloucester set his teeth. Since it had to be endured, he could at least compel himself to be calm. In the meantime, the leader had torn loose one of the wrappers, which secured the packages, and it exposed within a thick little sheaf of greenbacks. They were stiff with newness, and as he ran his fingers over the edge of the pack, they rattled like playing cards. Only 20s in this lot, murmured MacArthur. He added suddenly, What the devil is this? And with that he tore the money from its sheath. He stared at it for a long moment, and then he let it flutter in a green cloud to the floor. What's wrong? Gloucester asked. By God, MacArthur muttered to himself. I didn't think that little shriveled-up shrimp would have the nerve to try it on me. Try what? Shut up with your fool questions, MacArthur responded. Then he added, between his teeth, It's queer, all queer. He snatched another packet from his pocket, tore off the wrapper, and gave the contents to hasty scrutiny. This he dashed to the floor with an oath. Counterfeit. Stage money, he groaned. I'll turn Carney into a sieve for this. The fool ought to have known it. Good God, murmured Gloucester. Then they double-crossed you? He has. That means they're watching us tonight. It does, answered the leader. Then for God's sake, hurry, Joe. We'll have to ride for our lives. Damn our lives, said MacArthur. We've lost a fortune tonight. And he shook his fist at the safe as if that senseless mass of tool-proof steel were to blame. Next, however, he drew his revolver and held it in a stiff clutch. He gestured to Gloucester to do the same, and he made the motion. There was the soft but unmistakable sound of a door being closed somewhere nearby. All the strength passed out of Gloucester's big limbs and left him shaken. It appeared to him that the sound of that closing door was the sound of the prison gate clanging loudly upon him, and the voice of the hangman at his ear. Even MacArthur had started, and now he switched off his light. Fire at anything that moves, he cautioned, and led the way back, stealing with wonderful skill among the desks and the chairs. But Gloucester did not draw his gun. If there was fighting to do, he would use his hands to the best of his ability. If only the blood would run back into the muscles of his arms again, but he would not take a life. They had come to the outdoor corridor when a half-dozen shadows sprang up before them, soft and confused objects against the light-colored wall, and the gun of MacArthur exploded. The flash showed Gloucester for the smallest glimpse. 6 resolute faces, 6 gleaming guns. The reply was a blasting volley which would have torn them to pieces had it gone home. But at the instant of MacArthur's shot, the 2 big men dropped for the floor. MacArthur as a clever maneuver, and Gloucester because his shaking legs refused to bear him up. Take 'em alive, yelled a voice. The 6 plunged at him. A knee struck Gloucester on the ribs, another grazed his head, and half a dozen hands tore at him, striving for a grip. Now that contact of flesh against flesh sent the blood shooting hot through his veins once more. He heaved himself up. His assailants spilled off of him, then grappled close, but not close enough. Near him he saw MacArthur struggling with the men who had fallen upon him, and while the assailants were slight, MacArthur was cursing in a steady stream, although softly, as if even now he was striving to keep from alarming the town, as if that thundering volley, whose sound still made Gloucester's ears ache, had not aroused everyone within a mile of him. But in the meantime he had one arm and one hand free, a hand which would be balled into a lump as hard and effective as the jagged head of a club. One man had his arms around his waist, driving him back against the steel fence behind him. He struck that feller above the ear and he went down limply. A swinging hook brought down the next. The third leaped back with a cry of alarm from this fighter of such inhuman strength and swung up his gun that was never discharged. Unseen ruin sped at him through the darkness. There was only the flash of the fist before his eyes as it struck. Down he went, toppling head over heels and firing his bullet into the ceiling. Then Gloucester turned to MacArthur. The latter was big enough to have handled 2 men, but here were 3 of them, and each a sturdy feller. He was down on the floor, his curses stifled as his face was bashed against the concrete. Gloucester picked off one man as he might have picked an apple from the ground. He dashed him face down on the floor. The victim lay without a quiver. He leaned and crashed his swinging fist into the back of another man's neck. The third he tied into a knot and cast away. Then he jerked MacArthur to his feet. "Damn them," gasped Joe by way of thanks. "Now, fast work, Harry." He plunged for the door with Gloucester at his heels. They smashed again it. It had been locked from the inside and the key was removed. But now a bullet smashed the pane of plate glass and showed them the best way out. In the street there was a steady fusillade and a rising roar of voices. They beat out the rest of the glass with the butt of their guns and scrambled forth. They could see well enough, and everywhere they looked was ruin. At their feet before the door, sprawled on his back with his arms thrown wide, lay big Lou Cambridge. His face was unmistakable. He had come loyally to the defense of his leader and companion when the crisis came. So too had Sliver Martin, whose lean body was now crouched near by taking vain shelter behind a concrete hitching post while he emptied his revolver the windows of a nearby house. And every one of those windows, so it seemed, was filled with fighters who had waited prepared for the signal of battle. Against the blackness of the interiors of the rooms were firefly glows as rifles and revolvers spoke. The doors of the bank were a ruin from the concentrated fire which had been centered there. Now Sliver dropped to one side with one gasp and did not stir. Fatty Guinness and Dud Rainey rushed up, bringing a group of led horses. "Joe, Joe," cried Fatty, "for the love of heaven! Joe and Harry, where are ye?" There was heroism worthy of any battlefield. No gallant soldier who ran out from the trenches to carry in a wounded comrade better deserved a decoration than Fatty and Rainey. But the reward which Fatty collected at once was a bullet through the head, which drove him headlong to the ground. One of the horses squealed with pain as a bullet raked across its back, and the whole group bolted, saving only Rainey on his own horse. He was out of the saddle now, and across the street came Babe Cooney. He had stood off making a separate point of diversion, but now he came to join the others at their Waterloo, only to receive a bullet from behind that dropped him on his face in the dust. And all of this in the space of 3 seconds, as MacArthur and Gloucester clambered through the broken door. Chapter 35, The Sturdy Men of Wixon. Certainly, Oscar Fern had chosen his men well. Never had there been straighter shooting, although indeed that mass of lead which was sweeping toward the bank was sure to wash down any life that might be in its way. "Around the corner," cried MacArthur, and they darted away. They were out of the main focus of the bullets, to be sure. People could no longer shoot at them from the 3 corners. But right across the street were 5 men kneeling, each with a magazine rifle, from which they were pumping a stream of lead. The windows on that side of the bank began to go out with a crash, and MacArthur, with a gasp, dropped to his knees. 2 unwounded bandits remained, and of these only Rainey had a weapon in his hand. He fired at that kneeling row of marksmen. The center figure dropped. The 4 remaining fled to a place of safety, and the wounded man crawled after him. But still, where could the fugitives go? There was only 1 horse for the 2 unhurt men, and for 1 wounded, and this was Rainey's gallant pony, which had trotted around the corner to join him. There was only 1 horse for 3 men, and the whole town, as could be told by far-off shooting, was rising. And then it was that they saw two horses racing down the main street. Fern's men had chosen to charge him now? No. For the voice of one rider was shouting, "Gloucester, Harry Gloucester!" And he recognized Buck Daniels with an answering shout of joy. Yet Daniels did not reach them first. From behind him shot a great black horse with a slim figure in the saddle, a giant of a horse, which came sliding to a halt before them in a cloud of stinging dust. "Harry!" cried Joan. "Harry, are you here?" He had no time to feel horror that he should be there. "He'll carry two. Swing up behind, quick." But there, gasping in the dirt beside him, was Joe MacArthur, to whom he had sworn, looking into his eyes, that he would be faithful. He scooped the heavy body up in his arms, ran forward, and tossed MacArthur across the pommel of the saddle. What was that which MacArthur had groaned as he lifted him? "Save yourself, Harry, I'm done." "Down the street, Joan," Gloucester shouted, "as fast as the horse will run." "I can't leave you. For God's sake, Joan." Buck Daniels had drawn up beside them, and behind the saddle had leaped Dud Rainey. They moved off down the street with Gloucester racing between the two horses. Behind them was a new roar of guns and a shout of rage. They were out of one trap indeed, but they were already in the jaws of another. Straight before them a dozen men ran out into the street and threw themselves on their bellies. In another instant, the bullets were whistling. There was no facing that fire. Aiming by starlight and shaken with excitement, the prone men were missing, to be sure, but they were finding their range. In a moment, they would begin to plant their shots. Now down the street there was a confusion of yells as men were mounting horses which had been carefully concealed in backyards of the houses, and now they rushed for the pursuit. Ahead and behind them, their way was totally blocked. Buck Daniels, pushing to the lead, turned them into a new direction. The double doors of a livery stable yawned wide to the right. A single lantern burned dimly in the interior. They might sweep through this place and gain an exit to the open country behind. Even that, however, would not avail them long with only 2 horses for 5 persons. But in the stable itself they might be able to get new mounts. So with a roar of hoofbeats they dashed into the old building. Someone rushed for cover, throwing away a rifle in his haste. But Dud Rainey dived from the horse of Buck Daniels and caught the feller with a flying tackle, and down they went with a crash. By the time they had risen and the others had halted their horses, Joe MacArthur lay stretched on the floor where Harry Gloucester had laid him gently, and Joan, dropping from the saddle on the lofty captain, was kneeling at the side of the wounded man. In the meantime, with a yell of exultation, the crowd in the street poured around the stables. On either side and to the rear they ran, firing in the air in blind joy, and it was plain that they felt the group was trapped. Half a dozen ran for the open double doors themselves, but Buck Daniels ripped up the floor with a few bullets at their feet and drove them helter-skelter back. There was still something to be done before they took the building from the rear. Harry Gloucester sped to the rear entrance, and from the single door fired blindly half a dozen times at skulking figures. The reply was a rain of bullets and 1 or 2 yells of alarm, but the skulkers disappeared behind cover, and it might be taken for granted that they would not soon try to approach the stable from that direction. So Gloucester returned to the corner in which the others had gathered, and where little Dud Rainey held his captive by the collar. The latter was a much larger man, but his spirit was completely cowed. Fear of death filled up his eyes, which were starting from their sockets. The first care was for the wounded man. He had been shot through the body, and he was bleeding fast. Buck Daniels made a brief examination and reported that only a good doctor could give help to this injured outlaw. But how could they bring a doctor in to him? From the shadow behind the door, Harry Gloucester called to the crowd. "Is the sheriff out there?" "We don't need sheriff," thundered someone, "to handle a lot of hounds like you. We'll give you a belly fill before we're done with you." There was a loud roar of applause, which had taken up with a cheer from the distance, for men were gathering rapidly from every part of the town toward the sound of the firing. "Is there anybody out there in command?" thundered Gloucester again. "They've got enough. They'd rather hang than get their medicine now," came the answer. "Send for President Fern. He'll do the talking in good shape." Fern's voice came across the street, and it was not raised high, yet it pierced through the tumult easily and reduced the others to silence at once. "If you want to surrender," he said, "I'll see that you are brought safely to the jails. Is that what you want to know?" "We've got a man badly hurt in here," Gloucester replied. "If we bring him to the door, will some of you carry him to the doctor?" "And get our heads blowed off when we come for him?" taunted someone. "We wasn't born yesterday, old son." "What's our guarantee that you'll play fair and square?" asked Fern. "I'll bring him out and stand beside him," answered Gloucester. "Will that be a guarantee? If anybody goes down, I'll be that man." "Well, that's fair and reasonable," said Fern. "We'll deal fairly by you, my brave fellow. Bring him out." Gloucester went back to the others, and he found that there was a decided difference of opinion. What he had said had been heard, of course, by his companions in the stable. Joan, working with flying hands to bandage MacArthur, said nothing, but she raised her head and gave him a look that he could never forget. How he should interpret it, he could not tell, but it seemed to him that her eyes overflowed with her joy of him. But Daniels and Dud Rainey were strongly against the risk. "Somebody will take a chance and dump a shot at you," said Rainey. "Besides, there isn't a chance for poor MacArthur. When a man gets a bullet where he got one, it's all over." Daniels nodded agreement, and Joe MacArthur himself groaned from the floor. "You've done noble by me already, Harry. God knows that you ain't had any call to be square. Let me die here quiet. It'd ease me a pile more than thinking of being hung if I should get well." They might as well have talked to the wind. Gloucester leaned over the injured man, gathered him in his arms, and brushing through the others as if there had been no more than stubble, walked to the open door and through it. He marched on to the center of the street, and there he paused. "I've got a man that may be dying," he said. "If there's anybody yonder with a drop of mercy in him, come out and take him to a doctor." There was no answer. That yawning door behind Gloucester was like the open mouth of a cannon. Presently, Oscar Fern shouted, "I'm coming, friend. Boys, won't one of you help me carry him in?" He started running across the street. That appeal was too much for the manhood of the citizens of Wixon, and a round dozen followed. They swept around Harry Gloucester. "We've got him," said one of the last comers. "Why not take him back along with his wounded man?" "There'll be none of that," announced the authoritative voice of Oscar Fern. "By no means. I've never seen a braver thing than this in my life, and not a hand is going to be raised against this man." 2 or 3 of his companions took the heavy body of MacArthur into his arms, and the outlaw groaned with the agony of their touch. "Gently," cautioned Fern. "Dr. Sand will take a hand with him and do his best. And you, my friend, what's your name?" "Gloucester," he answered. That name brought a growl from the bystanders. It was too much to ask that they should be allowed to permit that notorious murderer to escape even for the moment. But the admiration of Fern appeared hardly shaken. "Gloucester," he said, "no matter what there may be in your record, this is a fine thing, and I wish you luck, lad, and better habits. If we take you alive out of that building, you'll find a friend in me." Gloucester thanked him briefly. He stepped back to MacArthur as the latter was being carried away. "Joe," he said, "good luck. Fight it through." "God bless you, Harry," gasped the wounded man. "But I'll see hell before you do. I'm fixed." So Harry Gloucester turned away and walked slowly back across the street to the door of the stable. And not a shot was fired behind him, and that, after all, was a fine tribute to the sturdy men of Wixon. Chapter 36. a stratagem of desperation. He found Buck Daniels and Dud Rainey in close conversation when he rejoined the group. As for Joan, she had withdrawn into the background, where she kept the captain quiet with her hand against his neck. His head was turning constantly from side to side, and his eyes flashed as though he realized the full significance of the scene through which he had just galloped. But he did not stir from his place. Rainey was trying to persuade Daniels that it was foolish for him to throw in his destiny with theirs when he had taken no part in the attempt on the bank. But it was not hard for Buck to prove to Dud that he was wrong. There would be a mob trial and mob justice for every unwounded man taken from the stable that night. They would not wait to ask questions and learn the truth, but like a pack of hounds which has been lately blooded, they would be eager for another kill. There was no real reply to such a statement, and Rainey fell silent. They turned back to their captive, whose fear had a little abated. They demanded to know the two best horses in the stable. He took them at once to the stalls. The prosperity of the town of Wixon was amply attested by the condition of its leading livery stable, for there were fully 30 animals in the stalls. Most of them were excellent mounts. There was no need for him to point out the best of the lot. A tall, wide-shouldered roan, apparently capable of bearing even the bulk of Harry Gloucester, and a slender-limbed little brown mare stood out head and shoulders above the rest. They saddled these and brought them back in silence, for it was plain that they had only one chance, and that chance was really a delusion. They must attempt to break through the front or the rear to the stable and ride to liberty. It was indeed worse than hopeless, for the street in front of the stable was lined with fine marksmen, all grouped within easy range of the door of the stable. Rainey went to the rear of the building to explore and came back with a report that the roof of every shed near the stable was thick with armed men. Whether they tried to the front or to the rear, there was sure to be a flood of lead poured at them. It was agreed that the best thing for Joan was to leave her behind in the stable. After the attempt to escape, when the crowd invaded the stable itself, they would find her and they'd let her go. Nothing else could be done with a woman by Westerners. And one glance at her would be sufficient to convince even the harshest of the mob that she was no Amazon. It was Rainey who thought of the stratagem which gave them at least a ghost of a hope. "What's the worst mark in the world to shoot at?" he asked. None of the others could answer. "What about a gang of horses stampeding?" Well, they nodded. Any man who had seen a mob of horses running wild, their heads packed full of fear, dashing on with mad impetus, which would carry them with equal recklessness into a fence or over a cliff, would have to agree that it was almost impossible to pick one mark in the midst of the swirling racing bodies. "But what's that got to do with us?" asked Gloucester. "Well, there's 2 horses here we have to ride," answered Rainey. "But there are 28 more, and 28 will make a pretty imitation of a stampede. Suppose we get them ready, put our horses in the middle, and then let go their halter ropes and give a yell. They'll be ready for the fast work. Listen to 'em now." For the stable was in a growing turmoil. In every stall there was a fretting horse. They had smelled powder smoke. They had glimpsed here and there through the cracks in the wall the flashing of guns outside. And above all, they had heard the battle shouts of men, which drive all animals into a frenzy of fear and excitement. It was done at once. They let out the stamping, rearing, snorting horses and gathered them 4 abreast in the driveway of the stable. Their lead ropes were tied together, which would keep them from scattering. In 7 ranks they were ranged. In the center, the riders would take their station and move with the mass, although at the imminent danger of having themselves bumped out of the saddles. There was only one thing left, and that was to say goodbye to Joan. She had not stirred or spoken since she took up her place at the side of the great black horse, and Buck Daniels came to her first. "Joan," he said, "tonight will show you what a free life means. This is the sort of thing that it runs into. When a gent tries to run free and take his own way, he runs into hell early. There's only one smooth way of traveling, and that's to keep with the herd, the way they go. I ain't saying this with the hope of changing your mind, but give it a think, Joan. There's something in it. She had listened impassively, her wide eyes fixed upon his face. It was all for my sake, she said at last. There would have been none of this if I hadn't left, and, oh, Dad. She paused there on that old word, and it shook Buck Daniels as if she had been a man and struck him heavily. Don't say that, honey, he answered gently. No matter what comes of this break to get away, it don't make much difference to me. You see, Joan, I've been tired of living for a considerable stretch now. It took something out of me when Dan Barry died, and it took a pile more when Kate followed him. And then I was sort of living on the inside of a lie, and that don't do a man no good. Sometimes in the old days when you called me Dad, it used to make things worthwhile. But I knew that before the end came, I had to tell you the truth, and that took the salt out of life. Now I come to the final roundup, and I'm glad of it. She bowed her head. Say so long to me, Joan. Say it with a smile. I'm aching to see you smile, dear. If I could live it over again, she breathed fiercely. Oh, if I had another chance. I'd make you happy, Dad, if it took the last drop of blood in my body. Things can't be changed, Joan, he said. What happens is what's planned. The older I get, the more I see it. There was a time when I loved Kate Cumberland and had a hope that I might make her love me someday. That day never came. There was a time when I tried to kill Dan Barry. But when the wind-up comes, what have I been? Just a tool, Joan. Something else took a hold of me and used me to work for Dan and Kate, and then used me to work for you. Now I ain't regretting, but that's been my life. And you'll do the same way. Not what you try to make out of yourself, but what's been planned for you way back in the beginning. Goodbye, dear. Somehow she was able to raise her fallen head, and she was able to smile into his face. And then he was gone. And she saw Dud Rainey before her. Wish me bon voyage, he said cheerfully. Good luck, she whispered. She caught one of his hands. Nothing can happen to you. I know it. He laughed and he stepped away. And there was the towering form of Harry Gloucester. His face was in shadow, but she knew that it was working and that words were forming in his throat and never reaching his lips. Then he was gone after the others in silence. She tried to cry out to stop him, but she could not speak. She tried to run out after him, but her feet were weighed down with lead. With all her mind and her heart turned to ice, she watched the final preparations. They went about their work calmly and methodically as men should do. There was no delay, no trembling, no vain regrets. The 3 saddle horses were brought into the center of the group of stable animals. Then Dud Rainey, with a gun on either hand, went out the back of the stable, and they heard him kick open a door, begin to blaze away into the outer night. There was an answering roar of guns which quite drowned his. Then came a yelling of 100 men, swarming back to meet the rear attack. And that was the moment for which they had waited. Rainey came racing back and leaped into his saddle, and all 3, yelling like wild Indians, turned the stable horses loose. Out they thundered. The din of their hoofs turned the stable into pandemonium, and from the street came the blaze of revolvers and rifles. Yet it was not a third of the volume which it would have been a little before. Many a score of good men had run toward the back of the stable when it appeared that the attempt would be made in that direction. And those who remained were enough to have riddled 10 times as many fugitives with bullets. But they had no fair mark. Out from the stable rushed a mass of horses, their heads stretched out with the fury of their speed. And it was hard indeed to mark the ones which actually carried riders on their backs, for these riders were flattened across the pommels of their saddles, showing almost nothing to the eye. Men who stood on the level of the street could do nothing. Only those who were posted in the windows with a half chance, and these, although they turned loose a plunging fire, were shooting wildly. They had expected at the very most 4 horses, and here was a herd of wild animals plunging down the street. And indeed, it seemed to the excited imagination of more than one man that there was a rider on the back of every animal, and that the 4 had been transferred by black magic into a host. There was no time for a second thought. That stream of horse flesh swept to the left as it shot out of the stable door, and it whipped away like a thrown javelin. All in a moment, there remained only a cloud of dust which made rifle work like shooting in a fog, and which stung the eyes and the nostrils. From every crevice, with wails of fury and rage, they ran into the street. They turned a storm of lead down the street. But it is an old maxim that one good marksman can often do more damage than a whole score of hysterical fighters. Not a single man was ready to whirl and fire in a new direction when, from the door of the stable, another figure started forth on an immense black horse, plunged through them and raced away down the street with a form no larger than the form of a boy flattened along his back. And that, my friends, is how they got out of that situation. Boy, that's a gutsy play. But makes a good little story now, don't it? Well, next week, when we get around this fire and I read you some more of this story, it'll be the last for this story. I can't wait to tell you. I'm looking forward to it. And we have fires between now and then as well, so come around anytime you wish. We'll be here. And until the next time I see you, this is Clay Steele. Be good.